We do have another little bit of a technology leap now because Sharon Taylor is actually in Adelaide running or assisting to run the annual Diagnostics and Surveillance Network workshop, which I think is a great idea, getting both the diagnosticians and the surveillance professionals together, which is it's the first time I believe this has happened. So with any luck, we're going to have, we're sitting here in Canberra, and Sharon will be online from Adelaide. So Sharon, over to you.
Great, thank you, Greg, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to run through surveillance and diagnostics, and just to confirm, we're actually running two workshops. We're running a surveillance workshop here in Adelaide, and we're also running the diagnostics one. And we're currently, right now, running a joint session of the two, which is a really unique opportunity for us to discuss that interface between surveillance and diagnostics. So whoever's running my slides, thank you. I just wanted to give some outline of the current activities. There's actually a lot of activity at the moment in the surveillance space, largely driven by an injection of funding from the Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper, but there's a lot of activity from, I think, all PHA members in surveillance, and with the recognition that surveillance is a very important aspect of both our biosecurity preparedness, but our biosecurity activities. We're currently at a national level putting together a case for a surveillance network. There's been a plant biosecurity diagnostic network running for a number of years now, and Stephen Dibley's been very instrumental in that. We're looking for the equivalent of a surveillance network, really to bring together surveillance practitioners, in the first instance in government, but certainly looking at industry partnerships within a surveillance network to really build our capacity and capability and to provide the tools and resources that are needed for surveillance. What we're doing as we start to build that network is, as with the diagnostic equivalent, we're right now have the development of a website underway. And in the first instance, that will be for practitioners for surveillance to provide those tools and resources. But we do see that hopefully expanding out into the future to provide a more public face for surveillance and actually really highlight the importance of surveillance. The main focus of the workshop that I've been at over the last couple of days has been the development of the reference standard for surveillance protocols, so that we can get a nationally consistent template for surveillance protocols for all surveillance activities. We've also looking at development of a reference standard for survey design. And so getting these nationally consistent standards that we can use for all surveillance activities. In the future, we're looking at the delivery of annual surveillance workshops. We've run two in the last, we've run one last year and one this year, and we're hoping to keep that going as an annual event. We're also looking at, once we have the reference standard for surveillance protocols, actually making sure that we roll out surveillance protocols. We'll be finalising the website in the next 6 months, and that will provide that repository of information and a go-to point for surveillance experts, and development of tools, as I said, to assist prioritise surveillance activities. We're actually at the national level looking at a prioritisation tool to help us focus for surveillance activities, and probably in the first instance focusing on those national plant priority pests, but really bringing in all industry high priority pests into that system. At a national level, the National Committee, the Subcommittee for National Plant Health Standards is providing a lot of guidance to agricultural competitiveness white paper initiatives and investments. Next slide, please. I'm trying to do that myself and I don't have control. In terms of surveillance programs, it's been really good to see there are a growing number of national surveillance programs underway, and they're forming with, I believe, really true partnerships between industry and government. And I'm going to run through a number of these, the first of which is the National Bee Pest Surveillance Program, and that's one of our more mature surveillance programs, a very effective program and a very effective partnership, I would suggest, between industry and government. It's driven by funding from Hort Innovation, from ARBIC and from the Australian government through Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper. We've also got some investment coming in from the Grain Producers Australia. With all of with new funding that's come in, there's significant enhancements which are being done, including Asian hornet trapping, bee virus survey, getting a baseline of our understanding of bee viruses, trials for remote catch boxes to improve capability in that area, and improvements to consistency of data collection. Next slide. Other industry surveillance programs that are really starting to roll out. A national citrus biosecurity program, which includes a big surveillance component. Once again, multiple funding partners and stakeholders involved, and it's coincided or been certainly sped along with the release of the National Citrus Biosecurity Surveillance Strategy, which was formally launched last week, and its accompanying implementation plan. We will be undertaking the appointment of a citrus biosecurity surveillance coordinator, and that's with recognition that we need a lot of firepower to drive these programs. The citrus program, one of the core parts of that program will be the establishment of that first detector network, which is really people who are out there looking at orchards day to day. So they're classified as first detectors. We'll also be establishing surveillance hubs, which will be really our first look at trying to establish surveillance into urban and peri-urban spaces, and actually really improving awareness of high priority pests of citrus. A second flagship program would be the National Forestry or Forest Biosecurity Program. Once again, industry and government partners in that program. It will coincide with the release of the National Forest Biosecurity Surveillance Strategy and appointment of a coordinator. And a key part of that program will be the establishment of high-risk site surveillance programs. So looking at those points where we can really get the most benefit from doing surveillance. And there will need to be a pathway risk analysis funded through the Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper to define some of those high-risk sites. The Grains Farm Biosecurity Program, once again an industry-led program, and surveillance activities are ramping up in that particular program, and there's been the initiation of what's been called the Silo Surveillance Program, which is looking at pests that are of most importance for market access for grains. Next slide. Thank you. Other surveillance initiatives which are going to have very big repercussions at the national level. There's been a few large programs. One in particular I'd like to highlight up front is the Rural R&D for Profit program. It has a very long title of Improving Plant Pest Management through Cross-Industry Development of Smart Sensor Diagnostics and Forecasting, also known as the Surveillance Hub Project, just internally, but we're looking at a shorter title of that particular one. That's looking at technologies that will help improve surveillance. And this particular project is a very important one because it includes all of the RDCs, the plant RDCs, I should say. And it's looking, the PHA part of that is to improve data capture and aggregation through AusPestCheck, but it has multiple partners and it will be looking at establishment of remote and physical hubs for surveillance, but mobile hubs that can move around the country depending on areas of most need for particular industries. That project's a 5-year project, so it's quite a significant investment. Another very significant project is a project looking at area freedom, and it will be assessing data and systems to establish pest-free areas under the pest-free area framework. PHA will be looking very shortly to release tenders for identification and collation of information for target pests, and those tenders will go out to our PHA members. Another project which is on the back of the successful work with citrus and forestry, but looking at temperate fruits and looking at scoping for national coordination or the requirements for surveillance for temperate fruit crops, probably with a recognition that temperate fruit crops on their own, while they're quite large industries in some instances, and also there can be smaller and emerging industries in temperate fruit crops, there's a potential that a regional approach might be more appropriate for temperate fruit crop surveillance. But it's really going to be about drawing members together to actually discuss the way forward to improve surveillance in temperate fruits. Next slide. Other surveillance initiatives that we have going, we have appointed an industry liaison manager to help industries look at surveillance needs and capability in Northern Australia. We know that Northern Australia has some fairly unique challenges and also some opportunities for surveillance. Trevor Dumble has joined PHA based in Brisbane, but he's working across all of the plant industries in Northern Australia. We also have a project looking at development of surveillance protocols, which will feed into those national initiatives I talked about earlier. This one's a focus on surveillance protocols for mango and citrus, but these should act as templates for other industries and really proofing with industry and with government how these surveillance protocols could be used. We've been looking not with a funded project at the moment, but we're looking to try and establish an initiative to look at botanic gardens as sentinel sites. And it was very interesting in the workshop I've just been in that most of the detections across Europe for brown marmorated stink bug have been in botanic gardens. That's not necessarily that botanic gardens are causing any problems, but they're actually a very good site to do surveillance in because they're managed and botanic gardens are looked at extensively by the people managing the horticultural or plants within them. And they're also a site that gets a lot of visits from tourists. So botanic gardens are a very important, I think, sentinel site for us. Next slide. And looking at national data capture, PHA has been very active in this space through the development of AusPestCheck. AusPestCheck does provide a very good forum for national aggregation of data. It doesn't replace systems that are necessarily in place within the state governments or within the Australian government or within industry. But AusPestCheck can aggregate and capture in a way that we haven't been able to do before, and I think it's a very valuable tool. It's been recognised as that value, the value of that through projects to enhance the functionality of it, to look at how we can petition some of our user groups and in terms of permissions and access to data, certainly improving collation of data to help us meet reporting requirements and to improve search functions so that we can assist with some of the inquiries that we may get once we start to nationally aggregate data. And also looking at developing mechanisms for efficient transfer of collection. We're certainly looking at AusPestCheck to aggregate data from some of these national programs that are being developed and put together. Next slide. Moving on to diagnostics, surveillance and diagnostics work for hand in hand. There's always been a lot of activity in PHA within diagnostics, and certainly for the establishment and maintenance of the National Plant Diagnostic Network, which very much helps our experts within diagnostics to maintain their contact with each other and build their capability and capacity. There's currently redevelopment of the website to make it a far more interactive tool for those diagnostics practitioners. There's always ongoing work in the diagnostic space for professional development, and there has been 4 workshops which have been run. There's currently a strategy being developed for national plant pest reference collections, which is incredibly important for our ability to undertake rapid diagnostics. There's been a tropical node established within the diagnostic network, and that's been another avenue to actually improve expertise and capability and capacity. There's the ongoing, in terms of future, there's ongoing delivery of an annual diagnostic workshop, one being held, the annual one this year, being held this week. There'll be finalisation of that website. There's also a look at surge capacity within the National Diagnostic Network using Xylella as a model. We're looking at the linkages for strengthening in-field what we call surveillance diagnostics, so diagnostics that occurs in the field, and not just those national diagnostic protocols that are being developed. Next slide. And in terms of diagnostic initiatives, PHA has been involved with auditing the capacity or the capability through the National Proficiency Testing Program, so a ring testing program to test labs around Australia and New Zealand. And a really big initiative that's consumed a lot of time, but I think is going to be an extremely valuable resource for Australia and the world, is the National Handbook for Identification of Fruit Flies and the supporting web tool. And we've got a couple of snapshots showing here of the web resource, which will allow both diagnostics to occur and also to look at preparing fact sheets for both for diagnosticians, but for anybody working in the space of fruit fly. That website's being in the final stages of being brought together, and it's really quite an exciting initiative, and I think will be, as I said, extremely valuable for anybody working in fruit fly. And I think that was the last of my slides. Yes, so up to questions. I can see that there's a couple of questions that have come in.
You can see them, Sharon, that's fine.
Yes, I can see these, and I'm just opening them up, so excuse me.
I think you've got a couple from Peter McFarlane, who these days works with Ollie. It's just one on surveillance,
Yep.
and I think we've probably covered it in some of the presentation. Current pest surveillance activities appear to be fragmented. How can expansion of this program be funded?
I think it is true to say that pest surveillance activities have been fragmented. In recognition of that, there's been a lot of work more recently in bringing it all together, and there is a very strong drive and led by the Australian government, but firmly supported and a lot of activity occurring in the space at the moment to build a much better framework for surveillance, to bring a lot of these activities together. PHA certainly has a linking role with all of that, and very much to connect industry and government partners through the current network being put together. I hope that answers the question there.
Sharon, and Peter's got another one. Perhaps integration of state and territory and Commonwealth diagnostic services would improve diagnostic accuracy and response time. I suppose it's a comment as much as a question.
Yes, definitely, and certainly being looked at. We're trying to do is develop much more consistent standards to make sure that everybody is on the same page when talking about surveillance. That doesn't mean that it will fix all problems. Surveillance and diagnostic are very complex areas, and sometimes for surveillance, there might not necessarily be an absolute right answer. There's often a number of ways that we can tackle surveillance. I think it's about keeping that dialogue open and making sure that we're coordinated in what we're doing.
Yep. You got another question from Diane. What are the two target pests for the Area Freedom Project? Yeah,
currently the two target pests that we're running will be tomato, potato, psyllid and capra beetle. That they're being used as exemplar projects for the Area Freedom Framework. There may be other pests that come on board to test that framework, and there's a matrix that we've been using to bring that together to actually make sure that we've got good exemplars which will then stand in good stead for the future.
Thanks for that. Look, we've just got a question from Peter to Susanna.
Yeah, hi everyone. So the question relates to CCEPP actions. So a significant number of CCEPP actions are unable to proceed to eradication because the pest is already widespread. Consideration that detection and diagnosis and decision-making processes is too protracted. So in essence, the decision-making process, I guess, under the deed is about, you know, whether it's an EPP, whether it's actually technically feasible to eradicate, and whether it's cost beneficial to eradicate. There's always opportunities to improve decision-making processes. There is an issue resolution group underway that's actually looking at decision-making. Capacity to write a timely response plan is also being looked at through supporting guidelines. In some instances, the pests that are actually being detected aren't actually causing a significant impact, and therefore, you know, the question around whether it actually meets the EPP status. So I think the question here really lends itself to further discussion at the annual general debrief, which is exactly what we're trying to do. You know, look at whether those particular CCEPP and NMG actions under the deed, both downstream and upstream, are actually, you know, as good and effective as they can be. So I encourage all participants to actually participate in that process. And I would actually like to thank Olive, who have actually already put in a submission for the annual general debrief. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, I'll just move on to other